The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when my phone rang. "Claire, darling, you simply must see this new penthouse in Manhattan," came the familiar voice of my real estate agent, Miranda Ashworth. "It's absolutely divine. Panoramic. City views, marble everything, and the building has a waiting list longer than the Met Gala." I smiled as I signed my name on the final document, officially ending my 8-year marriage to Derek Morrison. "Which building is it, Miranda?" "Morrison. Towers on the Upper East Side. You know, that gorgeous new development that everyone's talking about. The developer is supposed to be some mysterious investor who—" "I'll take it," I interrupted, unable to suppress the satisfaction in my voice. "Without seeing it? Claire, even for you, that's rather impulsive." If only Miranda knew the irony of her words. Derek had spent our entire marriage calling me predictable, boring, too conservative for his dynamic lifestyle. What he never knew was that while he was busy networking at cocktail parties and bragging about his marketing executive salary, his boring wife was quietly building a real estate empire worth over $300 million. And Morrison Towers, that wasn't just any luxury building Miranda was gushing about. I owned it. In fact, I owned 17 buildings across Manhattan, including the very penthouse Derek had been renting for the past 6 months with his new girlfriend. The same apartment where he'd been living since he moved out, claiming he needed space to discover who he really was without being held back by someone so ordinary. Tomorrow, Derek would receive an eviction notice. Not because he couldn't pay rent, but because the building's new owner, me, had decided to convert his unit into something more suitable, like my personal office. My name is Claire Morrison, and this is the story of how I went from being called a boring housewife to becoming the landlord of the man who underestimated me for 8 years. Some people collect stamps. I collected properties. And Derek was about to learn exactly who he'd been married to all this time. 5 years earlier, Upper West Side, Manhattan. "Claire, you're killing the vibe again." I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing property investment reports, to find Derek standing in our living room doorway. He was dressed in one of his expensive suits, the kind he charged to our joint credit card, while complaining about my unnecessary expenditures on things like groceries and utility bills. "I'm sorry, what vibe?" I asked, genuinely confused. "The Hendersons are here for drinks, and you're sitting in the corner with your computer like some kind of accountant." He said the word like it was contagious. "This is supposed to be a social evening." I glanced over at Jim and Patricia Henderson, Derek's work colleagues, who were holding martinis and discussing their recent vacation to the Hamptons. The kind of conversation that revolved around dropping names and comparing price tags. "I was just finishing some work," I said, closing the laptop. "I'll join you in a minute." "Work?" Derek laughed, and the sound had that edge it had developed over the past year. "Claire, you freelance for some tiny accounting firm. How much work could you possibly have?" The Hendersons chuckled politely, though I caught Patricia's sympathetic wince. She, at least, had the grace to look embarrassed by her husband's snickering. What Derek didn't know, what I'd never told him, was that freelancing for some and tiny accounting firm was how I described my consulting work for Morrison Properties, LLC. The real estate investment company I'd founded 3 years into our marriage, using money I'd saved from my actual job as a forensic accountant. Derek thought I worked part-time for a small firm that paid me maybe $40,000 a year. In reality, I was pulling in over $500,000 annually from my property investments, plus substantial consulting fees from helping other investors identify undervalued Manhattan real estate. "You're right," I said, forcing a smile. "Let me get myself a drink." As I walked to the kitchen, I heard Derek stage whisper to the Hendersons, "Sometimes I think I married the most boring woman in New York. She'd rather read financial reports than have a conversation about anything interesting." I paused in the hallway, hidden from view, as Jim Henderson replied, All wives get that way eventually, Derek. At least yours doesn't spend all your money on shopping like mine does. True, Derek laughed. Claire's so conservative with money, she probably still has the first dollar she ever earned. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be with someone who actually understands how to live. I stood there for a moment, processing the casual cruelty of his words. Then I walked into the kitchen, mixed myself a drink, and rejoined the party with a bright smile. Because here's what Derek didn't understand. I wasn't conservative with money. I was strategic with it. Every dollar I saved by shopping at discount grocery stores, every boring night I spent at home instead of at expensive restaurants, every predictable vacation we skipped, all of that money was being invested in prime Manhattan real estate while he thought I was just being cheap. The difference was that Derek saw money as something to spend, to impress people. I saw it as something to invest, to build actual wealth. So Claire, Patricia Henderson said, as I rejoined the group, Derek tells us you work in accounting. That must be interesting. The pause before interesting said everything. It has its moments, I replied diplomatically. I'm actually working on a fascinating project involving commercial real estate valuations in Midtown. God, Claire. Derek interrupted. No one wants to hear about spreadsheets and property values. Tell them about something normal, like a show you've been watching or a restaurant you want to try. But the truth was, I hadn't been watching shows or researching restaurants. I'd been studying market trends, analyzing cash flow projections, and identifying properties whose owners were struggling with debt and might be willing to sell below market value. While Derek spent his evenings at networking events and client dinners, I spent mine building a portfolio that would have impressed his colleagues if they'd known about it. But I'd learned early in our marriage that Derek preferred to be the successful one in our relationship. Any achievement of mine was somehow a reflection of his inadequacy, so I'd stopped sharing. When I'd gotten my first big consulting contract, I'd tried to tell Derek about it over dinner. He'd listened for about 30 seconds before changing the subject to his own work promotion. When I'd bought my first investment property, a small apartment building in Brooklyn that I'd gotten for 20% below market value, I'd started to explain the deal structure, only to watch his eyes glaze over. "That's nice, honey," he'd said. "Just make sure you're not taking on too much risk. You're not really. Cut out for high-stakes business decisions." After that, I'd stopped mentioning my growing real estate empire. Derek's friends saw me as the boring wife who worked part-time doing something with numbers. Derek himself saw me as financially naive, but harmlessly frugal. Our mutual friends saw me as the quiet one who let Derek dominate conversations about careers and achievements. What none of them saw was that I was systematically acquiring prime real estate across Manhattan, building a portfolio that would make Derek's marketing executive salary look like pocket change. The pattern had continued. For 5 years, Derek would come home from work complaining about his demanding job and difficult clients. I would listen sympathetically while reviewing emails from my property managers about rental income and potential acquisitions. He would suggest expensive dinners or weekend trips to spice up our boring routine. I would gently decline, suggesting we save money instead, while secretly calculating how much the saved money would yield when invested in my next property purchase. "You know what your problem is, Claire," Derek said later that night after the Hendersons had left. "You think small, you're content with your little job and your little life, but you don't understand what it takes to really succeed." I was washing dishes while he stood behind me, still in his expensive suit, holding a glass of wine that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean, look at Jim Henderson. He's moving up at the agency because he knows how to play the game. He networks, he takes risks, he invests in himself and his image. Meanwhile, you're afraid to spend $50 on a nice dinner because you think we can't afford it. If Derek had bothered to look at our joint bank account statements, he would have seen that we could afford pretty much anything he wanted. The account I contributed to was consistently well-funded, while his contributions often fell short due to his expensive lifestyle choices. But Derek never looked at bank statements. That was boring financial stuff that he left to me. I just think it's important to be responsible with money, I said, drying a plate. Responsible is one thing, but you're so risk-averse that you'll never understand what it means to really live. Jim was telling me about this investment opportunity, a chance to get in on a new restaurant concept, real entrepreneurial thinking, but you'd probably want to put any extra money in some boring savings account earning 1% interest. I nodded along while mentally calculating the returns on my most recent property acquisition, a commercial building in Soho that was generating 12% annual returns through rental income alone, with significant appreciation potential. Maybe. You're right, I said. I should think bigger. Derek brightened. Exactly. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You have to invest in experiences, in opportunities, in the kind of lifestyle that successful people live. What Derek meant was that I should fund his lifestyle while he continued to see me as his boring, conservative wife who didn't understand how the world really worked. What Derek didn't know was that his boring wife was about to make an investment that would change both our lives. I'd been watching a particular property for months, a luxury apartment building on the Upper East Side whose owner was facing financial difficulties. The building was profitable, but the owner had overextended himself on other investments and needed to sell quickly. I'd been preparing to make an offer, but Derek's words that night crystallized something for me. It wasn't just about the investment anymore. It was about the fact that my husband of 8 years truly believed I was incapable of understanding real success. The next morning, while Derek was at work impressing clients and playing the game, I made an offer on Morrison Towers. It was accepted. Within 48 hours, I now owned a 50-unit luxury building worth $47 million, generating over $200,000 in monthly rental income. And Derek still thought I was too boring to understand how money really worked. 3 years later, Claire, we need to talk. Derek's voice carried that tone I'd come to recognize. The one that meant he'd made a decision about our life without consulting me and was now going to present it as a reasonable discussion. I looked up from my tablet, where I'd been reviewing lease agreements for my latest acquisition, and found him standing in our living room with his arms crossed, still in his work clothes at 9 p.m., still carrying that air of self-importance that had only grown stronger over the years. "What's on your mind?" I asked, closing the tablet. "I've been doing some thinking about our situation," he said, beginning to pace. "About our future, our lifestyle, where we're heading as a couple." I waited. Derek loved building suspense before his pronouncements. "The thing is," he continued, "I'm at a point in my career where image matters more than ever. The agency is considering me for the creative director position, and that means I'll be representing the company at high-profile events, entertaining major clients, moving in circles where presentation is everything." "That sounds like a great opportunity," I said carefully. "It is, but here's the thing, this promotion comes with expectations, social expectations. I'll need to be able to host dinner parties, attend galas, take clients to the theater or exclusive restaurants, and I'll need a partner who can complement that lifestyle." The words hung in the air between us. I could see where this was heading, but I waited for him to say it directly. "Claire, you're a wonderful woman. You're responsible, you're stable, you're..." He paused, searching for words. "You're everything a man could want in a practical sense, but lately I've been wondering if we want the same things from life. Such as adventure, excitement, The ability to say yes to spontaneous trips to the Hamptons or last-minute theatre, tickets or, he gestured vaguely, the kind of life that successful people live. I thought about my day. That morning I'd closed on a commercial building in Tribeca. That afternoon I'd had lunch with a developer who wanted my advice on a mixed-use project in Brooklyn. That evening, I'd been reviewing proposals from contractors for renovating a pre-war building I'd bought in the village. But Derek saw me sitting quietly with my tablet and assumed I was checking email or reading the news. "I see," I said. "And you think I'm holding you back from that kind of life?" "Not intentionally," he said quickly. "It's just that we have different priorities. You're focused on saving money and playing it safe, while I'm trying to build something bigger. Take last week. The Richardsons invited us to their yacht club for the weekend, and you said we couldn't afford it." "I said we should be thoughtful about expensive trips," I corrected, "especially since you'd just bought that new watch." The watch had cost $8,000 and was charged to our joint credit card without discussion. But pointing that out would make me sound petty and small-minded, according to Derek's worldview. "See, that's exactly what I mean," Derek said. "You think in terms of what we can't afford instead of what we should be investing in. Relationships matter in my business, networks matter, but you don't seem to understand that." What Derek didn't understand was that I'd been building my own networks for years. Property managers, contractors, real estate attorneys, investment brokers, developers. I had relationships with some of the most influential people in Manhattan real estate. But since these weren't the kind of cocktail party relationships Derek valued, he didn't see them as meaningful. "Derek," I said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing?" He sat down across from me, his expression shifting to what he probably thought was gentle honesty. "I think we should consider a trial separation," he said, "just for a few months. Give each other some space to figure out what we really want. I could get my own place, somewhere in the city that's more convenient for work. You could stay here and think about whether you want to make some changes, become more engaged with the kind of life I'm trying to build." I stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he was saying. After 8 years of marriage, Derek was essentially telling me that I wasn't sophisticated enough for his career ambitions. "Where were you thinking of getting this place?" I asked. "Actually, I've been looking at a few options," he said, brightening now that he thought I was being receptive. "There's this amazing building on the Upper East Side, Morrison Towers. It's brand new, really exclusive, the kind of address that makes an impression." I managed to keep my expression neutral. "Morrison Towers? Yeah, it's incredible. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern finishes, full-service building with a doorman and concierge. The rent is a bit steep, but it's the kind of investment in image that pays off in career advancement." Derek was describing my building, the luxury development I'd purchased 3 years earlier and had been steadily improving and filling with high-end tenants. He was talking about renting an apartment in a building that I owned outright. "How steep is the rent?" I asked. $12,000 a month for a 2-bedroom. I know that sounds like a lot, but when you consider the location and amenities, $12,000 a month. Derek wanted to spend $144,000 a year on rent, more than twice what he contributed to our household expenses, so he could live in my building while taking a break from our marriage. "That does sound expensive," I said mildly. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Derek said, his voice taking on that familiar edge of frustration. "You hear $12,000 a month and immediately think about the cost instead of the opportunity. Do you know what kind of people live in Morrison Towers? The kind of people who could transform my career." If Derek had asked, I could have told him exactly what kind of people lived in Morrison Towers, because I personally approved every lease application. There was a hedge fund manager on the 20th floor, a Broadway producer on the 15th, a tech entrepreneur who'd sold his company to Google on the 23rd floor. all of them paying premium rent to live in the building I'd carefully curated to attract exactly the kind of tenants who would maintain the property's exclusive reputation. "When would this trial separation start?" I asked. "I've already put in an application for a unit," Derek said. "I should hear back next week. If I get approved, I could move in at the beginning of next month." Derek had applied to rent an apartment in my building without telling me, while asking for a separation. Because I was too boring for his lifestyle, he was trying to become my tenant. The irony was almost too perfect. "What if you don't get approved?" I asked. Derek laughed. "Claire, I make six figures at one of the most prestigious agencies in the city. I'm exactly the kind of tenant-exclusive buildings want." I nodded thoughtfully. Derek made $180,000 a year, which was certainly a good salary. What he didn't know was that I made more than that in rental income every month from my 17 properties. "Well," I said finally, "I suppose we should see what happens with your application." Over the next week, Derek was unusually cheerful. He came home each day talking about his exciting new life plan, the networking opportunities he'd have, the kind of dynamic lifestyle he'd finally be able to pursue. "I'll still support you financially, of course," he assured me. "I'm not abandoning my responsibilities. But Claire, this could be the beginning of something amazing for both of us. You'll have time to figure out what you really want to do with your life, and I'll have the freedom to pursue opportunities without worrying about whether they're too expensive or too risky for your comfort level." What Derek meant was that he'd continue contributing his current amount to our joint expenses, about $3,000 a month, while spending $12,000 a month on his new lifestyle. The math didn't work, but Derek had never been particularly concerned with mathematical realities. On Friday afternoon, Derek got a call from the leasing office at Morrison Towers. "Mr. Morrison, this is Jennifer from Morrison Towers. I'm calling about your application for Unit 2847. I was in the kitchen, close enough to hear Derek's side of the conversation. "Yes," Derek said eagerly. "I've been waiting to hear back. I'm pleased to inform you that your application has been approved. The owner has reviewed your materials and feels you'd be an excellent fit for the building." Derek practically bounced with excitement. "That's fantastic. When can I move in?" "The lease can begin on the 1st of next month. I'll email you the lease documents today, and we can schedule a time for you to sign and pick up your keys." After Derek hung up, he turned to me with the biggest smile I'd seen from him in months. "I got it," he said. "The apartment at Morrison Towers. Claire, this is going to change everything." "Congratulations," I said. "I'm sure you'll be very happy." There. What I didn't tell Derek was that Jennifer from the leasing office was my employee, and that the owner who had reviewed his application was me. I'd approved Derek's lease application myself, with special instructions to Jennifer about the terms and conditions. Derek was about to become my tenant, in paying me $12,000 a month for the privilege of living in a building I owned, while taking a break from our marriage, because I was too boring to understand his sophisticated lifestyle. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was what Derek would discover when he read the lease documents. 6 weeks later, the text message came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, while I was in a meeting with my architect about renovating the lobby of my newest acquisition. "OMG, Claire, you have to see Derek's new place. It's insane. We're having drinks there tonight if you want to join. Melissa." Melissa Chen was one of our mutual friends, though I suspected she'd remain firmly in Derek's camp after the separation. She was the type of person who was impressed by expensive zip codes and marble countertops, regardless of who was actually paying for them. I smiled at my phone and texted back, "Thanks for the invite, but I have plans tonight. Have fun." My plans involved reviewing lease renewals for my Brooklyn properties, but Melissa didn't need to know that. Derek had moved into Morrison Towers 3 weeks earlier, and according to his social media posts, he was living his best life. Photos of his amazing view, His incredible building amenities and his sophisticated new lifestyle filled his Instagram feed. He'd also been posting pictures from expensive restaurants, exclusive bars, and networking events, all funded by what I assumed was credit card debt, since his apartment rent alone exceeded his monthly take-home pay. But Derek wasn't thinking about math. He was thinking about image, opportunity, and the kind of life he felt he deserved. What Derek didn't know was that I received monthly reports on all my tenants, including detailed information about lease payments, any complaints or issues, and building amenities usage. From my property manager's reports, I knew that Derek was taking full advantage of every expensive feature Morrison Towers offered. The rooftop pool, the private gym, the concierge services, the valet parking. I also knew that his first month's rent payment had been late by 6 days, and he'd had to call the leasing office to arrange a payment plan for the security deposit. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Derek himself. "Claire, just wanted to check in. How are you doing with everything?" Derek had been sending me these periodic check-ins since he'd moved out. I think he genuinely believed he was being considerate, touching base with his estranged wife, who was probably struggling with loneliness and confusion while he figured out his exciting new life. "I'm doing well, thanks for asking. How's the new apartment? It's incredible. Honestly, Claire, I think this separation is exactly what we both needed. I'm meeting amazing people, exploring opportunities I never would have considered before. I feel like I'm finally living up to my potential. I'm glad you're happy. What about you? Are you doing anything different? Getting out more? Meeting new people?" I looked around the conference room where I was sitting with my architect and 2 contractors discussing a $3 million renovation project. Then I glanced at my calendar, which showed meetings with potential investors, a property inspection in Soho, and dinner with a developer who wanted to partner on a new acquisition. I'm keeping busy, exploring some new opportunities myself. That's great. I was worried you might be isolating yourself. You know how you get when you're stressed. You tend to retreat into spreadsheets and financial planning instead of actually living. I stared at the text for a moment, marveling at Derek's ability to be condescending even when he was trying to be caring. "I'm managing fine. Enjoy your evening with friends." "Thanks. And Claire, I know this is hard, but I really think we're both going to come out of this stronger and clearer about what we want." What I wanted at that moment was to text back a photo of my property portfolio and ask Derek if he thought $300 million in real estate assets counted as retreating into spreadsheets. But I'd kept my secret for 5 years, and I wasn't ready to reveal it over text message. Later that evening, I was at home reviewing the latest financial reports from my properties when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Patricia Henderson, Jim's wife from Derek's agency crowd. "Patricia," I said, opening the door. "What a surprise." "Claire, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced," she said, looking genuinely concerned. "I wanted to check on you. Jim told me about Derek's new living situation. I invited her in and made tea while she settled into the living room. How are you holding up?" she asked gently. This must be incredibly difficult. Patricia was one of the few people in Derek's social circle who had always been kind to me, even when others were dismissive of the boring wife who preferred staying home to attending expensive social events. "I'm doing okay," I said honestly. "It's an adjustment, but I'm managing." "Jim feels terrible about this," Patricia confided. "He thinks Derek is going through some kind of midlife crisis. All this talk about needing a more sophisticated lifestyle, needing a partner who understands success. It's not the Derek we've known for years." I served the tea and sat across from her. "People change," I said diplomatically. "That's just it, though. Derek hasn't changed. He's just become more of what he always was. More focused on appearances, more concerned with impressing people, more—" She paused, searching for the right words. more convinced that happiness comes from external validation. Patricia's assessment was surprisingly perceptive. Derek had always cared about status and image, but success at work had amplified those traits. "He's been posting constantly on social media," Patricia continued. "Pictures of his fancy new apartment, expensive dinners, exclusive events. It's like he's trying to prove something to everyone." "Maybe he is," I said. "The thing is, Claire, Jim and I have been married for 22 years. We've seen friends go through phases like this. The fancy apartment, the expensive lifestyle, the conviction that they need to find themselves. It usually doesn't end well." I sipped my tea and waited for her to continue. "What Derek doesn't seem to understand," Patricia said, "is that he had something real with you. A partnership with someone who actually cared about building a life together, not just projecting an image of success." If only she knew, I thought. Derek had been married to someone who was building substantial wealth while he was focused on spending money to look wealthy. "Jim is worried about the financial aspect too," Patricia admitted. "Derek's been talking about investment opportunities and business ventures, but his rent alone must be costing him a fortune. Jim doesn't think Derek has really thought through the mathematics of his new lifestyle. This was news to me. What kind of investment opportunities? Something about restaurants and entertainment venues. Derek mentioned he's been talking to other residents in his building about potential partnerships. People with money who are looking for the next big thing." I made a mental note to review the tenant list for Morrison Towers. If Derek was trying to solicit investments from my other tenants, that could potentially violate his lease agreement. "Has he said anything about our financial situation?" I asked carefully. Patricia looked uncomfortable. "He mentioned that you've always been very conservative with money. He seems to think that you're probably struggling with the increased expenses of living alone, and that the separation might help you realize that you need to be more open to financial opportunities. So Derek thought I was struggling financially, while he was living in luxury. The irony was almost painful." "Claire," Patricia said, leaning forward slightly, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem different. More confident, maybe? Like you're not walking on eggshells the way you used to around Derek." Her observation surprised me. "What do you mean? At parties, at dinners, you always seemed to be waiting for Derek's approval before you spoke up about anything. Like you were afraid of saying the wrong thing or being too much of yourself. But tonight you seem more relaxed, more present." Patricia was right, though I hadn't fully realized it myself. For years, I'd been carefully modulating my personality around Derek and his friends, downplaying my intelligence and achievements to avoid making Derek feel diminished. But with Derek gone, I could simply be myself, without constantly calculating how my words or actions might affect his ego. "Maybe separation has some unexpected benefits," I said. "Maybe it does," Patricia agreed. "But Claire, I want you to know that if you need anything at all, Jim and I are here for you. Financial advice, legal referrals, or just someone to talk to. Don't let Derek make you feel like you're on your own in this." After Patricia left, I sat in my living room thinking about her visit. It was touching that she was concerned about my welfare, but it was also a stark reminder of how completely I'd concealed my actual circumstances. Everyone who knew us, Derek's colleagues, our mutual friends, even well-meaning people like Patricia, indeed saw me as the financially dependent wife who would struggle without Derek's income and support. None of them had any idea that Derek was now paying me $12,000 a month in rent while maxing out credit cards to maintain his new lifestyle. But that wasn't the most interesting part of Patricia's visit. The most interesting part was learning that Derek was trying to network with my other tenants, looking for investment opportunities from people he assumed were wealthier and more sophisticated than his boring, estranged wife. Derek was essentially trying to raise money from my tenants to fund business ventures, while paying me rent to live in my building. I wondered how long it would take him to figure out who his landlord really was. 2 months later, the phone call came at 6:23 a.m. on a Thursday morning, waking me from the deepest sleep I'd had in weeks. "Mrs. Morrison." The voice was unfamiliar, professional, but tense. "This is Officer Rodriguez with the NYPD. I'm calling about an incident at Morrison Towers involving your tenant, Derek Morrison." My blood went cold. "What kind of incident? Is he hurt?" "No, ma'am, he's not injured. But there was an altercation in the building lobby last night, and during the investigation, some complications arose regarding his residency status." I sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What do you mean by complications?" "Well, ma'am, Mr. Morrison was involved in a dispute with another tenant about use of the building's amenities. When we arrived to take statements, he began making claims about his relationship to the building owner, claims that don't seem to match our records." My heart started pounding. "What kind of claims?" "He told us that his wife owns the building and that he has special privileges as a result. He said there must be some misunderstanding about access policies because his family has a financial interest in the property." "Oh, Derek." "When we asked him for documentation of this ownership claim," Officer Rodriguez continued, "he became agitated and demanded to speak to building management immediately. It's now 6 a.m., ma'am, and he's been insisting for the past 8 hours that we contact you to verify his story." I closed my eyes and tried to process this development. Derek had somehow figured out that I owned Morrison Towers, but he'd apparently drawn the wrong conclusions about what that meant for him. "Officer Rodriguez," I said carefully, "I am indeed the owner of Morrison Towers. Derek Morrison is my estranged husband. We're currently separated." "I see," the officer said, and I could hear him making notes. "And does Mr. Morrison have any special privileges or ownership interest in the building?" "No, he does not. He's a tenant like any other, subject to the same lease terms and building policies as everyone else." There was a pause. "Ma'am, I think you need to come down here. Mr. Morrison is having difficulty accepting this information." 40 minutes later, I walked into the lobby of Morrison Towers to find Derek sitting in one of the leather chairs near the concierge desk, looking disheveled and exhausted. 2 police officers stood nearby, along with my night security supervisor, Marcus. Derek looked up when he saw me, his expression cycling rapidly through relief, confusion, and something approaching panic. "Claire," he said, standing up quickly. "Thank God you're here. There's been some kind of massive misunderstanding. These people are saying you own this building, which is impossible, right? Tell them this is all some kind of mistake." I looked at Derek, really looked at him, and realized that despite being married to me for 8 years, he truly had no idea who I was or what I was capable of. "It's not a mistake, Derek," I said quietly. "I do own this building." The lobby went completely silent. Derek stared at me as if I'd just announced I was an alien life form. That's not possible," he said finally. "Claire, you work part-time for a small accounting firm. You clip coupons. You worry about spending $50 on dinner. You can't own a $47 million building." "Actually, I can. And I do." Derek sat back down heavily. "This is insane. When? How? Where did you get $47 million? "I didn't buy it for $47 million, I said. "I bought it for $32 million 3 years ago. It's appreciated considerably since then." $32 million, Derek repeated slowly. 3 years ago. Claire, 3 years ago you were clipping coupons and complaining about the cost of groceries. "No, Derek. 3 years ago you thought I was clipping coupons and complaining about groceries. What I was actually doing was building a real estate portfolio." I turned to Officer Rodriguez. "What exactly happened here last night?" "According To witness statements, the officer said. Mr. Morrison was using the rooftop pool after hours, which is against building policy. When security asked him to leave, he became argumentative and claimed that the rules didn't apply to him because his family owns the building. I looked at Derek with genuine curiosity. Why did you think the rules didn't apply to you? Because Derek started, then stopped. Because when I figured out you owned the building, I assumed, we're married. Technically, community property laws mean... Derek, I interrupted gently, we're separated. You moved out because you said I was too boring for your lifestyle. You're now my tenant, paying market rate for your apartment just like everyone else. But you're my wife, Derek said, as if this explained everything. Even if we're separated, you wouldn't really treat me like just another tenant. The cognitive dissonance was stunning. Derek had left me because I was supposedly too conservative and boring to understand his sophisticated lifestyle. But when he discovered I owned the luxury building he was desperate to live in, he immediately assumed he should receive special treatment as my husband. Mr. Morrison, Officer Rodriguez interjected, building security also reports that you've been approaching other tenants about investment opportunities. That could potentially violate your lease agreement. Derek looked confused. Investment opportunities? I pulled out my phone and opened the property management app that allowed me to monitor all building activities. Derek, you've had 17 logged interactions with other tenants in the past month. You've approached people at the gym, by the mailboxes, in the elevator. My security team documented everything because several tenants complained about being solicited. Solicited? Derek's voice rose. I was networking. That's what successful people do. They build relationships and explore opportunities together. You were asking my tenants to invest in restaurant concepts and entertainment ventures. I said, reading from the security reports. You specifically told Mr. Chen on the 20th floor that you had inside connections that could guarantee returns on hospitality investments. Derek was silent for a moment. Then, how do you know all this? Because I get detailed reports on all tenant activities, especially anything that might affect the building's reputation or other residents' comfort. You've been spying on me? Derek, I've been managing my property. You're a tenant who's been bothering other tenants with investment pitches. That's a lease violation. The reality of the situation was finally starting to penetrate Derek's consciousness. I could see him putting together the pieces, the building he'd been so excited to live in, the luxury amenities he'd been enjoying, the high-end neighbors he'd been trying to impress. All of it was mine. Claire, he said slowly, if you own this building, if you've had this kind of money all along, why didn't you tell me? It was a fair question and I'd had months to think about the answer. Because every time I tried to share my actual interests and achievements with you, you either ignored them or dismissed them as boring, I said. You made it clear that you saw me as financially naive and unambitious. So I stopped trying to convince you otherwise. But $32 million, Claire, how did you even get a loan for $32 million? I didn't need a loan. I paid cash. Derek's face went pale. Cash? Where did you get $32 million in cash? From selling other properties I'd accumulated over the previous 5 years. Other properties, Derek repeated faintly. Derek, while you were networking at cocktail parties and complaining about my conservative spending habits, I was building a real estate empire. I currently own 17 properties in Manhattan with a combined value of over $300 million. The number hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. 300 million, Derek whispered. Give or take, the market fluctuates. Derek put his head in his hands. I don't understand. How is this possible? How did I live with you for 8 years and not know you were worth $300 million? Because you never asked, I said simply. You never looked at bank statements, never wondered where my money came from, never showed any interest in my actual work. You assumed I was exactly what you saw on the surface, and you never looked deeper. Officer Rodriguez cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison, what would you like us to do about the building policy violations? I looked at Derek, who was staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. I think this has been educational for everyone involved, I said. Derek, you'll receive a formal notice about the lease violations, but as long as there are no further incidents, you can continue living here under the standard tenant terms. Standard tenant terms, Derek repeated numbly. Yes, which means no. After-hours pool use, no soliciting other tenants, and rent due on the 1st of every month. Derek looked up at me. Claire, we need to talk, really talk, about all of this. We probably do, I agreed. But right now, I have a property inspection in Brooklyn at 9 a.m., and you look like you need some sleep. I turned to leave, then paused. Derek, the rent for next month is due on Friday. Please make sure it's on time. As I walked out of the lobby of my building, leaving my estranged husband sitting there in shock, I realized something had fundamentally changed between us. For 8 years, Derek had seen me as the financially dependent partner in our marriage. Even during our separation, he'd assumed I was struggling while he was thriving in his new, sophisticated lifestyle. Now he knew the truth. I wasn't just financially independent. I was wealthier than he could have imagined, and he was literally paying me rent while trying to figure out how to afford his new life. The only question was, what would Derek do with this information? 3 weeks later, the email arrived on a Monday morning while I was reviewing lease proposals for a new commercial property in Chelsea. The subject line read, "Urgent discussion required, D. Claire. I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks, and I believe we need to have a serious conversation about our marriage and our future. I realize now that I made some significant misjudgments about our relationship and about you personally. I would like to propose that we meet for dinner to discuss how we might move forward together. I have some thoughts about how we could combine our strengths and resources to build something truly remarkable. I believe I can bring a lot to the table in terms of business development and relationship management that could help you maximize the potential of your real estate investments. Please let me know when you're available to discuss this." Derek, I read the email twice, then called my assistant. "Emily, can you pull the rental payment history for Derek Morrison at Morrison Towers?" "Of course," she said. "Is there an issue?" "Just curious about his payment patterns." 5 minutes later, Emily called back. "Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison's rent has been late every month since he moved in. The latest payment was 9 days overdue, and he's requested 2 payment plan modifications for the security deposit. What about his lease renewal? When is his current lease up?" "End of next month. Should I prepare renewal documents?" "Not yet. Let me think about it." After hanging up, I sat in my office considering Derek's email. 3 weeks after discovering that his boring wife owned a $300 million real estate empire, Derek wanted to combine our strengths and resources. The man who had left me because I was too conservative for his sophisticated lifestyle now wanted to be my business partner. The audacity was breathtaking, but I was curious about what exactly Derek thought he could bring to the table, so I agreed to meet him for dinner. We met at Le Bernardin, the restaurant where I'd worked as a server and first met Harold in my previous life story. Wait, that's wrong. We met at Daniel, an upscale restaurant on the Upper East Side that Derek had chosen, presumably to impress me with his sophisticated taste. Derek arrived 10 minutes late, dressed in an expensive suit that I was fairly certain he'd purchased on credit. He looked nervous but determined, like a salesman preparing to make the pitch of his life. "Claire," he said, standing to greet me with a kiss on the cheek. "You look wonderful." "Thank you for agreeing to meet." I dressed professionally, but not ostentatiously. A simple black dress and understated jewelry. Nothing that screamed, "I own more Manhattan real estate than most investment firms." "Thank you for dinner," I said as we sat down. Derek ordered. Wine without consulting me. An expensive Bordeaux that I happen to know cost $300 a bottle. Given his recent financial struggles, I found the choice interesting. Claire, Derek began after the wine arrived, I want to start by apologizing. I realize that I made some serious errors in judgment about our relationship. Such as, I underestimated you, he said directly. Badly. I saw what I thought was financial conservatism and assumed it was lack of ambition. I saw what I thought was contentment with a simple life and assumed it was inability to think bigger. He paused to sip his wine. What I didn't see was that you were thinking bigger than I could have imagined. While I was focused on earning 6 figures and impressing colleagues, you were quietly building an empire. I was building financial security, I corrected. The empire part was somewhat accidental. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, Derek said, leaning forward enthusiastically. You have this incredible instinct for identifying value and potential that others miss. But Claire, I think you're still not maximizing your opportunities. How so? Derek pulled out his phone and showed me a document he'd apparently prepared. I've been researching your properties and analyzing their potential. You own incredible assets, but I think you could be leveraging them much more effectively. I glanced at his phone screen, which showed a spreadsheet with my building addresses and estimated values. Where did you get this information? Public. Records, mostly. Some industry contacts. Derek looked pleased with himself. The point is, you're sitting on prime Manhattan real estate worth hundreds of millions, but you're operating like a small-scale landlord instead of a major developer. I'm operating profitably and sustainably, I said. But think about the possibilities, Derek continued, his voice taking on the enthusiastic tone I remembered from his agency presentations. Joint ventures with major developers. Conversion projects that could triple property values. International partnerships that could expand your portfolio globally. Derek had clearly spent considerable time researching real estate development strategies. Unfortunately, they were all strategies I'd considered and rejected for various reasons. Derek, I said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? A partnership, he said immediately. I bring business development expertise, relationship management, strategic planning. You bring the assets and the capital. Together we could build something extraordinary. And our marriage? Derek's expression softened. I want to rebuild our marriage too, Claire. I realize now that I was an idiot to leave. You're not boring. You're focused. You're not conservative. You're strategic. I was so caught up in pursuing what I thought was success that I failed to recognize I was already married to someone who had achieved real success. The waiter arrived to take our order, giving me a moment to process Derek's proposal. He wanted to reconcile our marriage and combine it with a business partnership. The man who had found me too boring for his lifestyle now wanted to marry my portfolio. After we ordered, Derek continued his pitch. I've also been thinking about the lifestyle aspects, he said. With your assets, we could be living at a completely different level. Manhattan penthouse, house in the Hamptons, maybe something in Europe. We could be entertaining major clients, hosting exclusive events, the kind of life that reflects your actual success. You mean the kind of life you wanted? Before you knew about my success? Derek had the grace to look embarrassed. I admit my priorities were misplaced. I was chasing the appearance of success instead of recognizing actual success. And now? Now I want to be worthy of the woman I married, he said earnestly. Claire, I spent 2 months living in your building, networking with your tenants, trying to scrape together investment deals while you were quietly running an empire. I've never felt so foolish in my life. There was something almost touching about Derek's admission. For the first time in our relationship, he was acknowledging that I had capabilities and achievements that exceeded his own. What about the creative, director position? I asked. The career advancement that required a more sophisticated partner. Derek winced. I didn't get the promotion. Turns out that financial overextension and relationship drama aren't great for professional advancement. Who knew? I'm sorry to hear that. Don't be. It forced me to reevaluate everything. Claire, I want to be your partner in every sense, business and personal. I want to help you build on what you've created. I studied Derek's face, trying to determine how much of his enthusiasm was genuine and how much was motivated by his precarious financial situation. Derek, can I ask you something honestly? Of course. Are you interested in reconciling with me or with my bank account? The question clearly stung, but Derek answered directly. 3 weeks ago, I would have said you were being paranoid, but given how badly I misjudged everything about our relationship, I understand why you'd ask. He set down his wineglass and looked at me seriously. The truth is, I don't know if I can separate my feelings about you from my feelings about discovering that you're incredibly successful. But Claire, I was attracted to your intelligence and your strength long before I knew about your money. You called me boring. I called you boring because your intelligence made me feel inadequate, and it was easier to dismiss you than to admit that, Derek said quietly. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth. Our entrees arrived, giving us another break in the conversation. As we ate, Derek continued outlining his vision for our potential partnership, both business and personal. Some of his ideas were actually quite good. Derek did have legitimate expertise in marketing and business development, and he was right that I'd been operating conservatively, focusing on stable investments rather than more aggressive growth strategies. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek's newfound appreciation for my character coincided suspiciously with his newfound knowledge of my net worth. Derek, I said finally, I appreciate your honesty tonight, but I need to ask, what happens if I'm not interested in a business partnership? Then I hope you'll still consider working on our marriage, he said immediately. And if I'm not interested in either? Derek was quiet for a long moment. Then I suppose I'll finish out my lease at Morrison Towers and try to figure out how to afford rent somewhere else. It was an honest answer, if not a particularly romantic one. Can I think about this? I asked. Of course. Take all the time you need. As Derek paid the check, with a credit card that I suspected was approaching its limit, I realized that this dinner had clarified something important for me. Derek wasn't the same man who had left me 6 months earlier. The experience of discovering my actual circumstances had genuinely humbled him and forced him to reconsider his assumptions about success, relationships, and what mattered in life. But Derek also wasn't proposing to rebuild our marriage based on love, compatibility, or shared values. He was proposing a merger between his business development skills and my assets. The question was, did I want a husband or a business partner? 2 days later, I made my decision. I called Derek and asked him to meet me at Morrison Towers. When he arrived, I was waiting in the lobby with Jennifer from the leasing office. Derek, I said, I've thought about your proposal and I have a counteroffer. I'm listening. I'm not interested in a business partnership. I'm also not interested in reconciling our marriage. But I am willing to offer you a consulting contract. Derek looked confused. What kind of consulting contract? I'm launching a new property management company to handle all my buildings professionally rather than working with outside firms. I could use someone with your marketing expertise to help develop the business. I handed him a folder. 6-month contract, renewable based on performance, reasonable compensation, no equity stake. Derek opened the folder and reviewed the terms. This is generous, but Claire, what about us? There is no us, Derek. Our marriage is over. But that doesn't mean we can't work together professionally if it makes sense for both parties. Derek stared at the contract for a long moment. And my apartment? Your lease expires next month. You can renew for another year at standard rates, or you can find somewhere more affordable. Your choice. Standard rates being 12,000 a month, same as you're paying now. Derek laughed ruefully. You know I can't afford that without the consulting income. Then I guess you'll need to decide what's more important, living in a luxury building or financial stability. Derek closed the folder and looked at me with something that might have been respect. You know what's funny, he said. 6 months ago, I left you because I thought you didn't understand how to live like a successful person. Now I realize that you understand it better than anyone I know. How so? You don't need to live in an expensive apartment or drive a luxury car or wear designer clothes to prove you're successful. You're successful because you built something real, not because you're performing success for other people. Derek signed the consulting contract that day. He also chose to move to a smaller, more affordable apartment in Brooklyn when his lease expired. 6 months later, Derek had proven to be an excellent consultant. His marketing strategies had helped me launch Morrison Property Management as a full-service firm handling not just my buildings, but properties for other small investors. We'd also finalized our divorce amicably, with Derek receiving a modest settlement that acknowledged our 8 years of marriage without giving him any claim on assets he'd had no role in building. At the divorce hearing, Derek made a statement that surprised me. Your Honor, I want it on the record that my ex-wife is one of the most remarkable people I've ever known. I was too foolish to appreciate that while we were married, but I'm grateful that I finally figured it out. These days, Derek and I maintain a professional relationship and a cordial friendship. He's dating someone new, a woman who appreciates his actual personality rather than his zip code. And he's learned to live within his means while building his own consulting business. As for me, I've discovered that being authentically myself, successful, ambitious, strategic, is far more satisfying than pretending to be someone smaller to make others comfortable. Derek was right about one thing. I was too boring for his lifestyle. But his lifestyle was focused on appearing successful rather than being successful. And I was never going to be satisfied with appearances when I could build something real. My name is Claire Morrison, and this is the story of how I went from being called too boring for my husband's sophisticated lifestyle to becoming his landlord, his boss, and ultimately the person who taught him the difference between looking successful and actually being successful. Sometimes the most boring people are the ones quietly changing the world while everyone else is busy making noise. If this story of hidden strength and quiet victory resonates with you, subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about people who prove that success comes in many forms. We share new chapters of extraordinary journeys every week, stories of individuals who turned underestimation into triumph and showed that the most remarkable achievements often happen behind the scenes. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a tale of resilience, revelation, and the power of staying true to yourself while building something extraordinary. Your next inspiration is just one click away.